Welcome back, guys. The Wimbledon of Chess Tata Steel 2026 has just kicked off yesterday, and of course, I'm gonna make a video about it. There were many games to choose from yesterday, but in the end, I decided to show you the game between Sindarov and the reigning world champion Gukesh. Other games that were very interesting included the pretty early victories by Hans Niemann and Vincent Keimer, which was quite surprising that those games ended pretty quickly, with Hans Niemann basically winning out of the opening after his opponent was not familiar with the line or mixed something up. And also Anish Giri losing pretty surprisingly in a Queen's Gambit, accepted in an endgame where Vincent had some pressure, but yeah, it's quite untypical for Anish to lose that way. But I have to say that it kind of reminded me about last year's event where I was there helping Hare Krishna as a second, and also there Anish Giri lost the first game pretty painfully against Gukesh, if I remember correctly. And after that, he had a pretty good comeback. So I hope for Anish that this is going to be the same this year as well. The game between Gukesh and Sindarov, which we're about to see, yeah, maybe it is not the most exciting, which or at least maybe people think that it's not the most exciting one, but there were many moments in the game which I thought were very interesting. So Sindarov, who is usually an e4 player, played d4 against Gukesh. I mean, one thing which is quite apparent for me is that many of the players who are playing in Tata Steel also are participating in the candidates tournament, which is not so far ahead, which will start in March, I believe. So only 2-3 months until the start, and yeah, 2 months I think, if I'm not mixing things up. And what I'm about to say is that the players who are also playing the candidates should kind of think about not revealing too much of their preparation, or too much of their openings which they want to play during the candidates. So that could be one thing why Sindarov maybe is mixing things up a bit here. But of course, it can also be said about many of the other players who are playing there, for example, Bluebaum or some of the others. We see Queen's Gambit, which we've seen quite often recently. If you missed my video about the opening ideas from the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz, I'll put an info card here, where I've also talked about the fact that people are kind of reverting to some of the very classical openings because there are still some ideas possible to be found there. Gukesh went for knight bd7, which is a solid line, and there are some twists where you can actually make it quite interesting, which Gukesh also did. After queen c2, which Sindarov played, main moves include bishop g5 immediately or bishop f4. White can also take on d5 and go to some Karlsbad like this, for example. I myself have played bishop g5 in the past, and usually something like this can happen when black takes on c4 once the white bishop moves. And in 1 or 2 of my games I played queen c2 here, which kind of has the idea that we are waiting. If black takes on c4, white will be happy to not have to spend a tempo, but black is typically equalizing with ideas connected with c5 pretty quickly. Usually black includes h6 first, and then after bishop h4 goes c5. But Sindarov goes for queen c2, and here there are a couple of moves for black. Black could actually transpose to some sort of anti-Maran with c6. I mean, white doesn't have to go for that, but white could now transpose to the Semislav with e3. But Gukesh goes for bishop to b4, which is not one of the main moves, but it's also nothing new. Black has started playing this bishop b4. Also after bishop g5, it's an option. And it is quite similar to some of the Rogozin variations, at least from the general idea to place the bishop on b4. Sindarov took on d5, went bishop g5, which is still following main theory, h6, but now he spent some time, which made it apparent that he was generally not so familiar with some of the sidelines in d4, which is understandable since, as I've mentioned earlier, he is mostly an e4 player. And he took on f6, which lets black equalize fairly easily. The main line continues bishop h4, and usually black goes g5 and has some knight e4 ideas when it's a fighting game. So yeah, very interesting choice from the opening from Gukesh, who just immediately tries to play for a win and does not want to go for any solid lines here. And as far as I can tell, it's perfectly playable for black. I mean, some of these lines can also come from the Rogozin. Maybe there are even some concrete transpositions. After knight d2, which white usually does, black will get some position like this, and the bishop actually often drops back to f8 after white goes a3, and black can develop with bishop e6. Queen can sometimes go to e7 or f6, and sometimes black even has the idea to castle queenside. But Sindarov took on f6 because he was believing, not so familiar with the line after bishop h4, and obviously Gukesh was, so I think it was to some extent a practical decision. Bishop takes c3 first. The whole point is why black cannot take immediately because of queen a4, which would pick up the bishop on b4. So that's why Gukesh includes bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, knight takes f6, and now we have a very classical Carlsbad structure. And one reason why I wanted to show you that game was because Gukesh handled that really well and managed to outplay his formidable opponent out of this seemingly very drawish position. So e3, knight e4, queen a3. I think that was all fairly natural. Now knight d6. Black wants to prepare castling, but does not necessarily want to trade queens. I mean, also this should not be a big deal. But generally now white could be the one who is pressing with ideas like b4, trying to play for this typical minority attack. Maybe not b4 immediately, because black now could play some c6 and immediately a5. But generally something like this also should not be a big deal for black. Maybe we can even play a5 and should also be equal. But again, Gukesh wants to keep as many pieces on the board as possible and wants to get a fight. So he keeps queens on the board. Knight d6, bishop d3, short castle. Now c6, knight e5, and now bishop f5. And Gukesh now achieved his goal of activating this often passive bishop on c8 in the Carlsbad structure, which is also one of the main reasons why this knight on d6 is on such a great square. Not only that it controls many other squares like c4, but also that it often facilitates the trade of bishops with bishop f5. Sindarov took on f5, knight takes f5 back, queen c3, a5 now, stopping white from the idea of b4, which anyway should not be a big deal, because just as an example now, black could have ideas, I don't know if f6 is an idea now. It is a bit weakening, but in general the knight often could look at the c4 square. Also some immediate counter with a5 could be another possibility here as well. But a5 anyway logical, and Sindarov played a4 with the idea that he wants to prepare b4, playing on the queen side himself. It's difficult what else white can even do, because well, a3 would allow black to fix the queen side anyway with a4, and in the long term black will have ideas to play in the queen on the king side, as we will see in the game. So a4 was played, queen to e7, rook b1, knight to d6, and now Sindarov goes for b4. Black should most likely take, not to allow white to advance with b5 or even to take on a5. So Gukesh took, and now another nice idea, just rook a7, preparing to double the rooks on the a file. And the a4 pawn is a weakness. On the other hand, the b7 pawn is not so much of a weakness, because the knight has a beautiful square on d6 where it is protecting b7 nicely. So knight d3, queen c7, stepping out of this pin right here. Also very natural, rook c1, rook to a8, and knight c5 already sort of a necessity. Otherwise, it could be quite difficult to keep a4 protected. You could go rook a1, but then you would need to think about b5, which already looks like it could lose a pawn. Maybe knight c5 is still possible, but yeah, not easy. Also now knight b7, maybe trying to exchange a knight on c5, after which a4 again is a very big weakness. So Sindarov goes knight c5, still using the fact that black is not in time to play b6 just yet, because the square is still protected. So Gukesh plays knight c4 first, knight d3, and now he could have played b6. That would have been possible, but I guess that he didn't like the fact that now Sindarov could play knight b2, which challenges the knight on c4, and after the knight is exchanged, then both of these pawns are weaknesses. I mean, black can almost never be worse here. Even you can take on b2 and then maybe on a4, but he made a decision that he wants to keep his pawn chain here intact. And he starts playing with h5, and this is what I said earlier. I thought this moment of the game was specifically instructive, that anyway, white does not have a lot to do now on the queen side. Everything is protected, and white even needs to worry about the a4 pawn. And in the meantime, black is sort of flexible to play on both sides. And white, for example, has a hard time now stopping black from gaining all of this space. h4 would be a possible move, but now white would need to worry about ideas like queen d8, attacking h4, g3. Now even immediately g5 would be a possibility, but also something slow like queen f6, maybe preparing queen f3, trying to enter there. And it's unpleasant. White needs to worry about g5 all the time, and black has some flexibility to play on both sides, but white does not really, because once he starts abandoning the queen side, then black can just take on a4 at the right time. So Sindarov plays h3. He does not want to weaken himself on the king side, but now Gukesh just tries to gain even more space on the king side. And Sindarov did not really find a plan here, which is understandable because there is nothing really that white can do now. And Gukesh just slowly but surely improves his position. King g7, rook e1, now he goes back, rook c1, queen to d8. He realized that maybe the king is actually better on g8, not that there can be some checks on this diagonal. Now knight to e5. His idea of queen d8 was to activate the queen on the king side. So if Sindarov would continue waiting like this, then already, for example, queen f6 could come, and at the right time, maybe king g7, g5, and trying to prepare g4 at the right time could be an idea to continue the attack with black. So Sindarov tries to exchange the knight, which Gukesh, again, rightfully so, declines. He goes back to d6, rook to a1. Now that the a4 is under attack, Sindarov needs to protect it. Knight to e4, rook a2, queen d6. Now offering an exchange of queens, because taking now would actually be quite risky. I don't think there's a good way to protect the pawn. If rook a1, then maybe rook a5, preparing b5 at the right time. Looks very unpleasant for white. So Sindarov keeps the queens, queen b6, queen to e7, queen b3 back, rook a5, knight d3, and now Gukesh goes for the breakthrough with b5. There was already not so much to do for white to actually prevent that. Maybe he can play rook c to c2 first, but still, now black can actually play a move like rook a7, and he has already improved his position. And still, play on the king side is also possible, like some idea like king g7, f6, followed by g5. It is still unpleasant for white. So knight d3 was played, and now b5, rook c to a1, and queen to a7. Hitting the pawn on a4, queen to c2, still only move, b takes a4, but now Sindarov made a mistake by playing the move knight to b4. He thought that he can recapture on c6 with a knight, but this does not work tactically, as we will see. Instead, he should have gone for queen takes c6, but the position still looks unpleasant after a3. This pawn seems more like a strength than a weakness, and even if white regains it sometimes, there can be issues on this pin on the a file. And also white's king is just weak in the long run. Computer screams zeros here, but practically speaking, it does not look very enticing for white. So Sindarov plays knight to b4, queen to b7, and now he takes on a4. Taking on c6 could run into rook a6, after which the knight also doesn't have many great squares. Has to go to e5, but now black could maybe enter here with rook c8. Maybe, I mean, the question is even where the queen goes. There are many knight forks on c3, so maybe even has to go to d3 and then rook c3 followed by a3. Still very unpleasant. So Sindarov took on a4 with the rook, and now there is the following idea, queen takes b4, which was a very strong find by Gukesh. It also seems like it should be very good, sacrificing the queen like this, because after all of those complications, there's king g7 or rook f1 immediately, but in general, white's king is going to be very unsafe, especially if both of those rooks appear on the first rank. There is going to be a major threat of rook h1 checkmate. And the pawn on h4 is very important for all of that, because once white tries to kick out the knight with f3, there's going to be knight g3, after which checkmate is almost unavoidable with rook h1 to come. So yeah, he starts with king g7. I guess he could have also started with rook f1 first, but yeah, he starts with king g7, rook b7, and now rook f1. If white tries to exchange rooks like this, there is always this idea with rook a2, and yeah, the pawn on f2 will drop after that. Like, let's just say I guess queen b3 is an option, and then take on b1 and rook takes f2, and position is actually completely lost here because black has the idea of knight g3 and rook f1 once again, and I don't think there's much that white can actually do about that. So Sindarov tries rook b7, now rook to f1, strong idea, and now white needs to act fast because otherwise rook a1 followed by rook h1 is going to be checkmate. So Sindarov still tries his best chance, which is to look for perpetual like this. Taking on f7, queen takes d5. And I was watching this live, computer said it's completely winning, but white still has quite a few ideas to try to play for perpetual check. Let's see what happened. King g7, queen to e5 check, knight to f6. White can never take the knight on e4 because then rook h1 is just going to be mate. So Sindarov tried queen e5, knight f6 back, queen e7, and now king h6. White still needs to continue checking, otherwise it's going to be mate in one. Sindarov did a good job with that. Gukesh repeated once, now king h5, queen to h8, only move, king g5, f4 check, again only move, otherwise it would be mate. King to f5. And we're gonna go through the moves here a bit more quickly. Gukesh played everything perfectly until some point. Now that Sindarov won the pawn on h4, at least it's not checkmate immediately, but the king, white's king is still gonna be very unsafe. So knight e4 check, king f3, rook f1, king to e2, rook f2 check, and now the king is forced to run to the queen side like this. So now king b3, I'm wondering what happens after king d5. Can you see it? There is a mate in one. I've just spotted it, rook c5. At first I didn't realize that d6 is covered, but that is actually a very nice, checkmate. White cannot take because the pawn is pinned. So king b3 was played, rook c3 check, king b4, rook b2, king a4. Now the king is already in a lot of trouble on the A file. Gukesh repeated once, and here is where he started to falter a bit. He played a move which is still winning, rook takes e3, but instead rook c1 was probably the most forcing way to win, but it's still not so easy to calculate all of that. Still, white has a couple of ways to try and set up some perpetual check. I've analyzed two lines in more depth here, queen g4 check or g4 check. After queen g4, king f6, queen h4, king e6, the checks should slowly run out. Like d5 check, king takes d5, queen d8 check, and now knight d6. And for example, if queen g8 check, there's king c5 when there are no more checks available. Rook a1 is a threat. White can still try king a3, after which it's maybe still not. I mean, now concretely there is knight c4, which is ending the game on the spot. But white can try also king a3 earlier. For example, here, when you could maybe try to go back with rook, but according to the engine, rook b1 was even stronger, which sets up a threat of rook b3 check followed by knight c3. And again, some similar lines like earlier will come when the king is going to escape at the right time. I've also looked at g4, king e6, and now f5. Take on f5, king d5, when again it seems like black's king is going to run out. For example, like this here. Queen e6 check, king d3, and white cannot take here. I mean, otherwise it would probably also be checkmate, but now rook a1 check, and this endgame is winning because white does not have any time to promote his pawns, and the king is just way too far to support them. But Gukesh went for rook takes e3, now queen g4 check. It is still winning now, but far from easy. King e6, queen d8. Sindarov defended well, we also have to say that. Now rook a2 check, Gukesh repeated again, but now is where he did not choose the most precise move again, rook takes g2. According to the computer, knight d6 was very strong, which keeps the king some companionship, which makes it more difficult for white to find enough checks. And if queen g8 check, then for example king d7, it's still not obvious how black is actually going to checkmate. But the king actually could also go to the queen side to look for some support. And there could be some ideas again with rook b3 trying to set up checkmates like this, or just a move like rook e1, which according to the computer is more easily winning than the game. But Gukesh took the pawn on g2, queen g8 check, king f5, but now it's going to be more difficult to set up checkmate threats without the king being cut off on the b file. Knight f6, and this is where now it is already a draw. Knight f6 was the final blunder, so Gukesh had to go back to e6 in this position. And after queen g8 check, it's very complicated. I mean, I'm now looking what what the computer is saying here. It says king e7, queen g7 check, and king d8. And like I'm having also trouble to understand where the king is running. Let's say queen to f8, king d7, queen f7, king d6, queen f8, king d5. Apparently this is where the king is going. And then you're trying to run out like this, or even to take on d4, after which it should be winning. I mean, another thing I was wondering, like if we get a position with just queen against two rooks and the knight, I mean, I was quite sure that it should be winning, but it would be interesting to check that as well. But I mean, I'm 99% sure that two rooks and a knight against the queen should be winning. Mostly, unless white does have some concrete way to set up a perpetual check. So Gukesh goes knight f6. He was also quite low on time, which is understandable since the game is already at move 70 at this point. And I think that he missed one idea, which we're going to see now. King takes f4, queen d6 check. The king has to go back to f5, queen c5 check, or has to go back to g5, which he did on the next move. And I'm assuming that maybe he missed from afar that white still has this idea with h4. And if the king takes, then white is actually going to be able to make a draw here. Still might not be actually so easy, but he will have some counterplay with the d pawn. Like for example, after g5, I would be thinking maybe something like d5, and at least it's not so easy anymore for black. And white also has counter chances. Maybe even immediately try to give perpetual with queen h8, queen c8. Could be some ideas like that. So Gukesh tries king f5, but now they actually went for the repetition immediately, and the game was drawn. So that was my recap from the first day of Tata Steel 2026. I've really enjoyed watching all of the games. I mean, I could have done recaps on many games, not only in the Masters, but also in the Challengers, where there were quite a few interesting games and surprising results as well. Anyway, that was it for today. Hope you enjoyed this recap. Let me know what you guys would like to see for the remaining rounds of Tata Steel 2026. If these recaps are working for you, or if you would like to see something else. If you like the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also visit my website. It's in the video description down below. That was it for today, and I'm gonna see you guys soon.